I am? So, how a fish tank broke into a casino. A fish tank. Did you read that article already? So, the thermostat in the fish tank was connected to the Wi-Fi network. And we wonder how we're going to get into some of these new things. How many of you see that Amazon Alexa Dots are on sale today? $39. An Amazon, so it's a little Amazon Echo Dot. It's about, so it's about the size of a can of tuna. Bless you. And we plug them into our networks, and we have people bringing them to work or to the college campus, another place to go, man, I really need my Alexa, or I need my Google Home, or what's the other ones out there? There's a ton of them out there, these devices. We're just plugging them into our networks willy-nilly. Do we know they're safe? Do we think they're safe? Out of my house, do I care if somebody hacks in to my Alexa and is listening to my conversation? Or they hack my fish tank and they know what temperature my fish are at? Which right now my fish are really dead and they're cold, so they'd get a really interesting reading out of that one. But these devices are designed to give us security, we think, make our lives easier. And so last week we talked about SCADA. SCADA. You should have done an assignment about it. Those of you that look puzzled going, oh crap. So it's what we call an ICS, Industrial Control System. And we figured out, holy cow, these weren't designed with security in mind. And some of you even found out a password for one of them. But that's been long since changed. So, all these devices around us. How would you like to explain to the owners of the casino how 10 gigabytes of your data, including the data on your, what they call whales or your big players, disappeared out of the door? How would you like to have to call up a billionaire and say, hey, we lost your information? How do you think that goes? Do you think somebody gets fired over these? Yeah. They do all the time. But more importantly, and one thing that's interesting is nobody's yet figured out what casino it is. Now, the company Darktrace can tell you if you've had enough money, I'm sure. But the reality is they lost this data. So now we have more and more devices. And in fact, some of the really creepy ones. How many of you have children? No, none of you. Yeah. How many of you have seen your younger brothers and sisters with little plug-in web devices? Yeah, they've all got all kinds of these little toys now. What if we hack one of those and then we're in on your network? So it's just a little bit of thinking about what's going on around us and where these are coming from. And I think this, what we call the IoT, is where we're going to find a huge number of attack vectors coming in. So one of the things that's interesting is this came out from a company called Darktrace. And Darktrace, if you haven't read about them, there is a giant market for startup security firms. It is estimated to be a $70 to $100 billion business in the next year. That's a lot of money. So how do we take advantage of it? And these guys certainly have, but they've published a report. And this report is actually in week 14 as a PDF that you can look at. And I just want to look at a couple of the items, because it really is things we've talked about. So, ransomware. So we've talked about that. These IoT devices. Now, what they're talking about here, we've talked about denial of service attacks. And you guys made your own in here with small denial of service attack against my own server. But now if I could grab every Amazon Alexa or every Wi-Fi thermostat or every DVR and all these different things we're plugging in, and I have now 1 million things that I can send those little pings with, I can do some serious damage really quickly. And since they're not based on any kind of secure model, we can do a lot of damage with those. So, insider, so somebody that's inside our company. And so this one, in this case, they're talking about healthcare, but really it can apply to any company. Banking Trojans, so in other words, hiding on your computer every time you think you're logging into your bank, you're giving somebody else your credentials. Using former employee, because a lot of times we don't take out former employees. We just assume they can't get on a computer. We use those former employers. So now one of the things to remember is this is actually a sales piece, but here's some details about the connected fish tank. What's interesting is this just now again surfaced a couple days ago in a lot of headlines, but the reality is I think it was back in June or July is when this actually supposedly occurred. So 10 gigabit of data, right out of the fish tank. So those IoT devices, scary. Intellectual property rights, internal data theft, Bitcoin mining. And we've talked a little bit about that, but one of the things that's really going on now is people are hijacking your computers. They're hijacking your company's computers, and they're trying to coin or mine Bitcoins. It can be a fairly lucrative operation. Even though Bitcoin has now dropped under $10,000, last year at this time it was at about $300. One Bitcoin went from $300 to $10,000 in a year. In fact, it was significantly over that. At one point, it was close to $20,000 this year. One Bitcoin. So that's just a really quick example of some of the things that are out there. So I'll make sure that both classes have this one available. It's just kind of an interesting take on, hey, what we're doing is really happening out there in the world as we speak. And so here's another article about that particular thing. So where we're going to go today, though, we're going to go on the happy side. We're going to talk about ways we can save our data, ways we can keep our business up and running. And they call it business continuity. So in other words, we continue our business. How do we continue our business? What kind of strategies can we put in place? And we're going to create this week's your assignment is you're going to create a personal assignment. So what is business continuity? So it's that idea that we plan so that we can continue operations. We do that at almost every business, I hope. If your business does not plan for this, they will be very sad. And natural disasters happen all around. So whether it's a malicious hacker, whether it's a lightning storm that hits your building, whether it's flooding, whatever it is, these are some of the plans we're going to put in place so that we can keep going. So our college, one of the greatest things we have as a continuity operation, what if we had a bird flu epidemic? We've threatened it, we've seen issues about it. What would be the response of a bird flu epidemic? What could we do? So you guys could still attend classes, what could we do? I don't want to see you face to face because who knows who's infected, right? But what could we do? What would be a business continuity model for Nebraska is infected with bird flu? We don't want to gather in groups. Web chat, online courses. Yeah. So what I laugh about is many, many years ago, in fact, it was about the first time we heard the term bird flu, we actually had a lot of stuff going on at Offutt Air Force Base and outside of Offutt Air Force Base. And so the plan was, at one point, to gather all those people and drag everybody down here onto our campus and have a big meeting about it if the bird flu hit. And I'm kind of sometimes the dark cloud in the room. And I went, if bird flu or something like this really came in, the people that are traveling a lot, that go through like the Air Force Base, wouldn't that be a place where they might come in from? And then we're going to put them all together in a room so we can get everybody sick. Oh, maybe that's not a good idea. I'll sit down now. So we need to think about those kinds of things. Sometimes our knee-jerk reactions are different than what might be a better way to model. So these are things. How do we continue operating? So schools have done this. Some high schools, middle schools have shut down for several days to try to stop flu epidemics, right? You've seen that? Well, in that case, they make up days at the end of the year. Our model here at the college, though, is a little harder to do. So we would simply shift most of our services for a couple of weeks to online. We'd figure out a way to do it. And one thing that might do is cut out mandatory meetings. Yeah. But We need to have a way to continue to operate. So think about what happens at a hospital. So I've been involved in some hospital moves and procedures. You're going to shut down a hospital and move to another location. They're opening up a brand new hospital. In fact, they're doing that in Syracuse here in a few months. They're building a hospital if you've driven through there. What do we do about something even as simple as the phone? At some point, you're going to have to turn off a phone system, move it, and turn on the other one. How are we going to deal with that? Because people call in to things like hospitals or 911 systems all the time. How do I deal with those moves? So writing down a procedure for, all right, so we're going to have to notify the entire community, notify them that it's shut down, put in place some temporary cell phones or something so you can do that. That idea of keeping those operations going. We can't just shut 911 down. So if we're going to move a dispatch center, for example, for a police department, those kinds of continuity, those 24/7 ones, but it happens in every business. We need to stay operational. So even this, and it's kind of creepy, what happens if somebody dies in your organization? So if you work for a small company, what are you going to do if somebody passes away? Those key employees. Do we have that planning in place? What happens here at the college if we lose a key employee? Vice president, president, dean keels over tomorrow. Do we have plans in place of how we're going to operate? What if you work for a small business and that small business owner has not shared things like passcodes? There's no way to get that information once they're gone. So we kind of call that the if you're hit by the bus scenario. Because it could happen to any of us. Maybe it's a 20-year-old in your business that has all the IT knowledge, all that information in his head, but it's not been documented, and he gets hit by a bus. We don't want to think about it, but it happens. So we really take a look at these risks, and we start thinking, and we've talked about risks in several courses. You've probably looked at it in project management. You may have looked at it in other ones. So we need to figure out that risk, but doing so, we look at it in how do we continue operating. So those things that are a greater risk. So here, a disruptive event might be a power outage. Do we have power outages in Peru pretty frequently? Yeah. So we need to plan for that. But we don't have a lot of hurricanes or tsunamis, right? But do we have the threat of tornadoes? And those are, if you've been in an area that's gotten hit by a tornado, they're pretty severe. So we base that risk based on our risk for a tornado is pretty high. Our risk for a hurricane, pretty low. So we'll base our events on that. What about flooding? Is Peru State going to flood? But does flooding of the Missouri River impact us as a business? Yeah. And in fact, the last time it flooded very severely, it impacted us. Even though we're up here, we're not going to flood. But where are the water wells and the wastewater and the sewer treatment plants and everything located? Oh, they're down by the river. And they were very nearly in danger of flooding, and we wouldn't have had water. Well, water would have been probably an issue here. So again, that idea of how do we come up with plans. So we identify what is going to be a threat to us. So power outage, hackers, hurricanes, whatever it is, and we create a plan and a recovery plan for that. But more importantly than anything, we can create all the plans we want. We have to test them, try them out, run an exercise, and see if that's going to work. So most of you have been in a fire drill at some school at some point, right? And they made you go run outside. But do we do that here? We have a fire drill, but has anybody ever had to leave the classroom? No. What do you do if there's a fire? Where are you going to meet? How do I know that you didn't fall asleep on a computer back here and you're still in that computer lab while the building's burning? And in fact, we did have an exercise many years ago that went horribly wrong. Because we said, we're going to have a fire drill. We're actually going to make people leave the building. Okay? We're going to do the counting to make sure that everybody's there. So I should have a class roster maybe somewhere we can get to, right? Because, we don't know. I should have checked off every morning. Everybody's here. So everybody runs outside. And we're doing a mock fire drill. Alarms are going off. Somebody goes, huh, all the students seem to have gotten out. All the faculty and administration have left the building. But the daycare, nobody went down and evacuated the daycare. So that fire drill, I would say, was a pretty interesting disaster. Great. We're the school that, we got all of the students and the adults out, but, the 3-year-olds were on their own. It happens. So we have to plan those and go over and over and over again how we deal with that. So one of the terms you see is a DRIP, or a DRP, Disaster Recovery Plan. So how do we get back to where we existed before? So plans, procedures, data backups, which are one of the key things. If you don't have a backup of that data, you're like the kid who lost his flash drive down the toilet on the day before the final was due and didn't have their 10-page paper. If you don't have backups, that's one of the key things. And we have the ability now to do backups to the cloud. You can do them to a tape drive. But think about the backups and that safety of it. Where does it land? I did a backup on my flash drive and then I put it right beside the computer. My house burned. Oh, crap. So these recovery plans, very detailed, very comprehensive, updated. So if you have a disaster recovery plan at your business and it's dated 1984, it's probably not worth a flip anymore. So they need to be updated, and you need to figure out a plan to go through them. They need to be tested. If you don't test if that data is backed up, you might as well not have it backed up at all. So, what kind of things are going to be in there? Why are we doing this? What are the different risks and procedures and safeguards that we're going to look at? So, what are our emergency procedures? How do we restore things? Maybe we look at each building here on campus. What happens if we have a tornado? If a tornado takes out this building on campus, is that going to affect the rest of the campus? Do we have enough classroom space in the rest of the campus to accommodate this if this building went out? No. So, quite frankly, we probably need to address that issue at some point, because we couldn't even really do a remodel in this building very effectively. Those of you that were here a couple years ago when they were trying to remodel this building while you're taking classes because we couldn't afford to take it all down, it was a pain in the buttocks. And we're working around dust and drywall and moving things around. So if this building caught on fire, we would be in trouble. How would we deal with it? What could we do? Bring in portable classrooms? So we need to have a plan of how all those things would happen. So this is kind of a model of one. So this says, all right, the communications room. So wherever we have that, it's going to include wired telephones, cellular telephones, and even maybe a satellite phone. So if your business depends on communication, is there a chance we could lose cell phone signal in this area? Yeah. What if a lightning strike? Have we maybe had a tornado? Oh, there goes the tower out there by the cemetery. And now suddenly we don't have cell phone signal either. So they may even have things, you may have other kinds of radios, other things in there, some way to communicate and get out. So you may have, in our case, we may have police band radios. So one of the things we do is something called a desktop exercise or a tabletop exercise. In other words, we simulate an emergency. And some of you may have gotten to participate in some of those for community-wide. And I've certainly done that where, be the body on the gurney and they're trying to see if the hospital can manage 25 dead bodies or, 25 people that have been in an accident and those kinds of things. So we look at things. So here's a model of some of the things we're going to do. One of the problems with it, so it does do a lot of stress testing, and we talk about issues, but we don't have that realism. So people sometimes go, whatever, it's just a test. I know that all my data is really backed up on this flash drive that I will never lose. One of the things we look at is this idea of single point of failure. And we look at it, what is one thing that can bring down our entire business, our entire network in this case, or bring down our company. So here in this area, for many years, this entire campus ran off of a single fiber optic cable that went running down the road. It was a single point of failure. If the road construction crew happened to cut into that cable, Peru goes dark. You don't have any ability to have your web server up. Blackboard was actually hosted through it at that point. We didn't host it externally. One point of failure. What can happen? So now we actually have redundant communication paths. So we look at things in terms of, we know that things are going to fail. How do I make them redundant? And so one of the things I'm going to hand out here, I'm going to hand to Moo and let her look at it, pass around. So this is a hard drive, but it's wrapped in a strange container. And in fact, it's got a handle on the front. It's designed to come out. So we make things in redundant multiple sets. So this particular hard drive on my server back there can come out at any time. And it does that. I can swap it out. So if I have one bad hard drive, I can actually replace it right away. So one of the things we do is measure things in what's called nines. If you buy service, so if we buy an email service from Google or another company, you may buy service based on a set of 9. The more 9s in there, in other words, the more numbers after the decimal, this is how much time on this chart that your contract allows. So if you buy service, if you bought 6.9 service, and you bought that from Microsoft for internet services, they would be allowed to have on contract 31 seconds of downtime in a year. Well, that's not bad at all. And it's one of the differences. If you go pricing out internet service, for example, as a business, you're going to pay significantly more as a business than you are as a consumer. Because as a consumer, you don't even get any of this in terms of a service level agreement. They'll turn on your internet again when they darn well get to it, right? If you've had Spectrum, I'll make fun of Time Warner Cable. I'm not afraid. So they have issues down here. They're single-ended. They have a single point of failure. One cable cut on the edge of Lincoln, the entire southeast corner of Nebraska is down. We don't have this level of service. If I buy a commercial account, I pay to have this service level agreement. And if I'm somebody like Amazon, can I lose a lot of money even in 30 seconds of being down? You bet. And I certainly can't afford to be down for 36 days in a year, right? So part of the reason you pay more on those commercial accounts is you're buying that service level agreement that says, I'm only going to be down for, at most, X number of minutes or X number of hours or whatever it happens to be. Now, the company then usually has a reimbursement for if you're over this limit. So if they are down longer than that. Now there's some exceptions. So another term you may see is something called mean time to recovery. In other words, how quickly can I recover back to the state I was? So in a lot of cases, like that hard drive that I'm passing around, those, and we'll look in the server closet here at some point, you'll see that we have multiple hard drives. If one dies, I don't have any mean time to recovery. It's immediately we're still back up and running. In most cases, most servers and network equipment has multiple power supplies. So if one dies, the other one will take over. So we have that idea of redundancy. We usually have multiple servers so that the load is shared and that if one dies, the other one can take over the network. All of that redundancy, though, doesn't mean a thing if people don't pay attention and they're not following this plan they have. How many of you have been down by the Sac and Fox Casino in Kansas, down on 75 Highway? Driven down there. There's a casino down there right by 75 Highway. Well, what you may not know about most casinos, they're really not controlled on site. They actually send a lot of the data and it's controlled from an outside control site. And that's kind of one of those business plans they model so that it makes it a little harder to break in. Well, there's actually a fiber that goes in a loop that feeds that casino. and I was involved in a telecom project, and we cut one side of their loop. Well, all right, we got fiber sticking out of the ground. Oops. Well, at this point, in what we call a CO, a central office, alarm bells should have been ringing, people should have gotten pages, and this should have been an emergency event. But somebody just turned off the alarms and said, it's okay, we're still going. So we go down another mile. Well, that fiber comes down that country road, another mile down. They didn't mark it very well, and guess what? We snagged the other end of it. Now the casino goes dark. And even a casino sitting in the middle of Kansas on Highway 75 on a 2-lane road, the amount of money that they lose by having to close their doors because you've cut off their communication is pretty extensive. And that phone company that was supporting that, all of a sudden that was an issue. Holy crap. So if we don't follow these rules that we've created and we don't plan for them, you could be down a significant amount of money. Bless you. So there's a couple of things we can do. So servers, we can put servers into what's called a cluster, so it appears to be one unit. And now that we've got virtual devices, we're starting to see more and more of this appearing. That idea of we have 10 or 12 or 15 servers, but it really appears as one. And so if one goes bad, we can flip into the other one really, really easy. So a couple of different models. You have the asymmetric and the symmetric. This is probably less important at this point with virtual images. Usually what we really have now are asymmetric clusters. In other words, the computers, we assign tasks where they need to be, and with tools like vMotion, we can move that working image to anywhere we need to if a server dies. But if we only have one server, we really are in trouble. And so this is that idea of that cluster. So here we have multiple computers. In a lot of cases, we have a shared storage pool, so we can still get into that data. But in here, I can see a single point of failure. What if notice that public cluster connection, what if that connection dies right there? Can your clients get to the servers? No, we have no redundancy. So one of the things we talk a lot about, the most common thing to fail is a hard drive. It's still in a lot of cases mechanical. And even the solid state drives will fail for a lot of other reasons. So your laptops, your desktops, you may buy solid states. This lab is now based on solid states. It's very fast, it's very quick. But they're still significantly more expensive than spinning drives. And so Google, Yahoo, Facebook in their data center, they're still using traditional spinning drives like the one I passed around here. And they do have a failure rate. They do fail. And so there is a term, mean time between failures. And so I used to talk a lot about this when I taught production and operations management, and we looked at what's called the bathtub curve and how they failed, and we'd run statistical models on it. We're not going to make you do that. But what I will say is that a single hard drive has a fairly good lifespan, statistically. But when I put 10,000 of them together, that means several of them are going to fail every day, just because of the numbers in there. So how do we determine how many hard drives we have on hand? Spare hard drives, spare components. That leads us to something called RAID. So RAID says, we're going to put our drives together. We're going to put a whole bundle of them together, and we're going to use multiple drives. And we're not going to put all of the information on just one drive. We're going to split that information out across that whole set of drives. On top of that, we're going to use what's called parity data. So we're going to split what's called parity data, or the contents of that drive, we're going to put it over multiple drives. So if one dies, we can recreate that drive. So even if a hard drive dies, we can recreate it. So we have what's called RAID level 0. So 0 is a great way. If you guys are gamers and you want to put your drives in RAID level 0, so 2 drives, and it reads and writes to both of them at the same time. and it stores part of your data here, part of your data here. So imagine your hand. Part of the data is on left, part of it's on right. If your hand gets chopped off, there's no way to get that data back. But it was very fast while it ran. So we don't use RAID level 0 for protection. We may use it for speed, but only on data that we know isn't going to disappear. So here's RAID level 0. And you can see by the letters where we're storing data. And it's stored individually on each drive. So if drive C dies, we've lost this information. It's gone. We can't recover it. RAID level 1 is kind of the exact opposite. And so if you notice on level 1, we mirror, this drive is mirrored completely to this drive. This drive is mirrored completely to that drive. This would be ideal if we had unlimited money. If you had unlimited funds, this would be great, but you're buying twice as much storage as what you need. And on a lot of servers, we do this. So smaller servers, so if you're snooping around in the server closet back there, we have a couple of what's called pizza box servers. They're only about yay tall. They only have 2 drives. And that's actually what we do with them. We mirror one to the other. They don't store a lot of data. It's really just for the operating system and the pieces that bring it up. But RAID level 5, this is where it gets more interesting. Because RAID level 5, if you look at this, we store what's called this parity. So we take a piece of this drive and store chunks from the other drives on it. And we take a chunk from this drive and we store chunks from the other ones in it. And so if drive C dies, all of the rest of the data is still there. I can get the parity from here, 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 and here, and I can put that back. I can rebuild this cluster, and I can recreate that. And in this case, if one drive dies. If 2 drives die, all of a sudden, I'm still hosed with this particular model. But it's better. We're getting closer to what we would use. And so what this does, it essentially, we have as much storage space as N-1. So if I had 5 hard drives, I'd have the storage space of 4. And so we use this model a lot because it gives us a ton of storage and it does it fairly affordable and with some predictive monitoring. So that RAID controller is going to tell us if it sees a hard drive failing. They usually don't just die instantly. We'll get some notification about it that, hey, I'm starting to have some issues. In addition, a lot of the controllers that run this system like this will have another hard drive sitting right here in what's called a hot spare. So it's sitting in that drive bay, and as soon as that RAID controller goes, oh man, I have a problem with RAID C, it'll turn this one on and recreate all the data across it automatically. So it does some of those things automatically for us. So we have some other models that you can have. So they call this one RAID 0+1. So this really says, we use that striping, so we put data on 2 different drives for speed, because I can read and write to one drive, only it's so fast. When I'm writing to 2, it's faster, and then I combine that with mirroring. So again, if you had unlimited money, this is a great tool. There are more RAID levels than what you see in here. So what you'll see is there's one called RAID level 6 that's pretty common, and RAID level 10. So you're going to see some other models. But kind of this RAID level 5 is one of the most common things we do. That way we can distribute data. Looks like a big giant plate of single data to us, but it's really stored on a variety of drives. And so on the back end of those, we can go recreate a lot of that really, really easily. So other things we need to look at. What about our entire network, though? So we need to figure out some way we can save our network. Things we otherwise need to do. So what if we lose our internet connection here? What if all of a sudden Galaxy Cable or whoever owns that fiber says, nope, we're done. We're closed for today. Well, now we have that redundant connection. And more businesses are willing to pay to put in a second internet connection. And so we have routers that can handle having 2 internet connections, and as soon as it fails one, it'll reroute your communications to a second router. And you may think, man, I'm not paying another 60, 70, 80, 150, 200 bucks a month. But if your business depends on data and you need to have that uplink, it's probably worth it. If you've got a call center with 500 people employed and you lose data, I would not want to be the one explaining to the vice president that we didn't budget for an extra couple $100 a month for a redundant connection. So in a lot of cases, we can even set it up where it's seamless to you. Maybe we also do some other things, because internet service on a business is expensive. So we have probably, for our second connection, a much less robust connection. So the minute we roll over to that, we do things like cut out people from internet streaming. All right, guys, I know, but we lost our connection. Turn off the internet streams. Those kinds of things that we can do. Quit watching Netflix on your computer while you're trying to work. So we can actually launch some policies. And I've seen a lot of them where we have a group policy that we can then push out of, limited internet connections. So we start bandwidth limiting people with different rules on a firewall or rules on the individual computers. This issue happens a lot. Unfortunately, we lose power here. We lose it so much, if you look on your desk, what do you think this big box up here does? It's a surge protector, but it's also a battery backup. It's called a UPS, uninterruptible power supply. So this, if I were to pull the plug out of the wall where this is plugged in, it has a battery. It will actually run these computers for a short amount of time. These are called an offline UPS. So this is a cheap solution. These are about $100 a piece. And in this case, we're running, in most of the cases, we're running 4 computers off of one. Some offices, you may put each computer on one. In our server rack, we actually have a much bigger UPS, and it powers our server and some of our network gear in here. So these, the offline UPS, when the power gets unplugged or we lose power, it automatically turns on and says, oh, yep, power, I'm powering with the battery right now. So offline UPS, pretty cheap, affordable. If you don't have this at a minimum on your network equipment, again, you probably should be thinking about where you're at and where you're working. Online UPS is a little different. So we know that power, especially here, is pretty crappy. If you actually measured it, you're going to see that it is really bad. So it'll dip, it'll surge. So online UPSs take the power in, and they're charging the battery all the time. But they're also discharging the battery, and the battery is powering that equipment. So no matter what the power coming in, the power going out is going to be at the right level until that battery is exhausted. So most of the time these are more sophisticated. They will actually communicate with you. They're usually plugged into the network. Either way, online or offline, you have a limited amount of time. In the case of this, where we're really overloading them a little bit with 4 computers, or in this case 6 actually, we have about 5 minutes of runtime. But that seems to help here with our power, because a lot of times it'll go off for a few minutes, comes back on. That will keep us up and running. In the back, I can run the server for about 40 minutes, it seems like, depending on what it's processing and how fast it's churning away. But again, they're 2 different levels. The one in the back was about $1,500. These were about $100. So you can figure for a UPS big enough to run a rack full of equipment in your server closet, you're probably talking $3,000 to $5,000. I'm fairly limited back there. I have one server and a couple of other pieces we run continually, so I can get by with that unit. But it's one of those things you don't want to skimp on. You don't want to skimp on the idea of, how do I keep my business operational? So now we're going to move up the scale. So we may have to have a backup site, depending on our business model. So Blackboard has a backup site. They have multiple sites that they can operate Blackboard from. We have multiple sites for MyPSC. We have a site in Lincoln and we have one in Omaha. If that backup site in Omaha needs to come online, it's what's called a hot site. Now, in this case, it's not actually run by a commercial firm, but it is still a hot site. In other cases, we may buy a hot site or buy the rights to a hot site from a commercial vendor, and they know that all of our production equipment is duplicated. All of our servers, all our ability to run all our equipment, and those data backups, generally what we're doing is we're sending that data backups to them on a pretty regular basis. So they have everything but maybe the last week's worth of data. We're sending on a weekly data backup. Or in some cases, it may be so duplicated that that hot site can switch on immediately, and it's got all the data, all the equipment, all the backup. And I hope that's how Blackboard is actually running. And it seems to be, because they shut down their primary site when we had a hurricane a couple years ago. We contrast that to what we call a cold site. So it's got office space, but you have to provide all the equipment. So this might be a good idea. If you routinely get flooded, maybe you're in New Orleans, and you know that you're going to get flooded. You buy a site or lease a site a couple 100 miles away. You know the hurricane's coming. You get all your equipment, you load it up, so your employees are loading up all their desktops and all the servers, run it up to that site, and you can stay up and running until that event is over. So, less expensive by far, but it takes longer. So it's that continuum of how quick do I need backup, how much downtime can I afford. So companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, they can't afford to be down for a significant amount of time. If you run a 10-person insurance company, you could probably take a couple of days and move your operation and still be fine. And then somewhere in the middle is this idea of a warm. So you can think of it as a big continuum. In the middle, we have a site that's got most of the equipment's already there. So maybe they have a set of terminals. Maybe they have all the networking pieces. Maybe they have servers sitting there. But your data's not there. But you can turn it on and you can get up and running in a couple of days or a day. So we have those continuums, and you want to think about that when you're trying to look at business continuity. And it's something when, especially on a startup, a lot of times doesn't get thought of. It's expenses and money that we don't want to spend. So how are we going to deal with it? Well, this is what's happening with a lot of companies. We've talked about in other ones, we've talked about software as a service, where now I don't have to buy a server. I can just run my server off of the cloud. I can be in Amazon Web Services. I can be in Microsoft Azure. There's a ton of different companies. Maybe it makes some sense now from a business standpoint in continuity to move some of those services online. So if I can put everything on the cloud, maybe that makes it easier. I don't have to maintain hardware. Is it cheaper than having my own stuff? No. Because they're making money on Amazon Web Services. It's really cheap to start out, but if you're using it and you're paying on a transactional fee, you're going to pay a pretty good chunk. But a lot of companies have decided it makes sense. Most of you have heard of Netflix, right? Netflix moved all of their operations, except the actual storage of the videos, to Amazon Web Services. Because for them, it made sense. So if we can move enough stuff, it reduces, may even eliminate that need for redundant sites. It doesn't mean you don't need backups. The cloud can fail too. The cloud really just means you're running on somebody else's server that you have a little less control over, but you still need to practice all the same requirements. So we're going to talk a lot about data backup. What do we need to back up? How often should we back it up? What do we store it on? Where do we store that backup at? What software? What hardware? What can we do? And my guess is most of you are like the rest of us. We've lost data because you didn't back up your computer and you dropped a laptop. You didn't back up all your files. And at some point it's bit you in the butt. Well, at a business, that value of your business is oftentimes really based on the data that you have. How much is that information? So we want to look at some models that might make sense. So we want to look at a couple of ideas that happen. So with your data stores something called an archive bit. And backup software can flip that archive bit. So it's a little like you're marking it with a tab and saying, all right, if this data has been backed up, I'm going to flip a marker and say it's backed up. And so there's really 3 different models of backups. So there's a full backup, where we take every chunk of data, and we back it up all at once. And then we have what we're going to call incremental and differential backups. Ooh. And there is a subtle difference between the two of them, what the difference is. So it's all based on this idea of this bit. Let me see if I have a better way to explain this. So that archive bit says, all right, Monday, all those files are flipped that say they got backed up, and it changes it to a 1. So a file not backed up has a 0 in place of a 1. And so by looking at that, we can actually say which files got backed up and which ones didn't. At some point, we'll clear that, so when we modify that file, we'll clear it, so the next time it gets backed up again. If I could only do full backups, it would be really expensive, because every time I did a backup, come back here. So if I had a backup, and every time I did a backup, I had to grab everything in there. So maybe I had a terabyte of data. Every backup's going to be a terabyte of data. It's also going to take a long time for that backup to happen. So we have a couple of different models. And so the differential backup says backs up any data that is not, or that has changed since we did the last full backup. Okay, so here's my data that's already been backed up. Here's my changes, and I'm going to grab those. And so I have to have both of those files. I have to have the full backup, and I have to have that differential backup in order to restore that data. So 2 files. And every day, so we may do, so if we did a full backup on the week, that differential backup for Monday, if we backed it up on Sunday, is going to be all the data for Monday. The differential backup for Tuesday is going to be the data for Monday and Tuesday. The differential backup for Wednesday is going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So each day past that backup, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have to set some pretty realistic full backup dates. So generally like a week, and then we do those. That differential file can get fairly big. But it works very handy because I only need the full backup and one other file, that differential file. The incremental backup works slightly different. Take my backup on Sunday. On Monday, I get an incremental backup of Monday. It resets all those zeros. And so Tuesday, I get a backup of only the data from Tuesday. And on Wednesday, I only get the data for Wednesday. On Thursday, only the data for Thursday. So when I need to restore that data, I need Monday's data, Tuesday's data, Wednesday's data, for Thursday's data, plus my full backup. And so it may take a lot more files. And the chance of one of these files being corrupt, the more files I have, the greater that is. So I'm not a really great fan of incremental backups because I have seen it fail quite often because you need all of those individual files. I really do like the differential backup and fairly regular full backups. That seems to make a lot of sense, to my mind anyway. So we decided we're going to back up. Where are we going to back up to? And so the most common things we're doing now are disk to disk. So in other words, we buy enough spare hard drives and put them in another server that's got enough storage space that we back them up to a hard drive. It has some advantages. It's fast, and we can grab any piece of that data. In other words, I can search for data and find it. The other model that we use a lot because of the storage size is something called disk to tape. What? Disk to tape? We're still storing data on tape? Yep. So the disk to tape model, we're storing them on new tape cartridges. They have to spin all the way through. So it's like, if you guys all used a cassette at some point, and you had to fast forward, rewind, you couldn't just say, I want song 6, like you can on a CD or when it's in your iPod. So disk backups have that advantage of, I can go straight to it. The tape backups, I can store a tremendous amount of data, and it's comparatively cheap, but I have the downside of, it's in a linear format. I have to scan all the way through it. So I have to read all the tape data in to be able to use it. So my recovery time's a little worse. So we have a lot of different models in here. We may also do some other ones. So we may do what's called continuous backup. And so if you're backing up to enough, if you have enough data storage on your own at a remote site, or you're backing up to the cloud, you may back up in what's called continuous data. So you may back up everything as it happens. Not at the end of the night, you do a backup. You may back up continually, all throughout the day. Or you may take it in like 15-minute increments. Every 15 minutes, you do a differential, and you go, whoop, that's changed, I'm going to back that up. This is a pretty handy thing to do if we have the ability to do it. And one of the things we can also do with that, if we're backing up continually or nearly continually, is in some cases we store copies of all your files. So every time you delete a file, we actually have a copy of it. And so I can go snapshots back and do that. So you're seeing that happen more often. We're able to back up data that way. So here we look at some of the objects. So our magnetic tape, so it's slow to return our data, but its cost is moderately low. It's significantly cheaper than if I had to buy enough drive space to be able to back up to it. But disk to disk, as disks, hard drives are getting cheaper, it's becoming more and more viable even for really, really large companies. Because those hard drives that we use for backup are different than the ones we passed around. The ones we passed around, so you could see them, are different than your home drives. Your home drives are designed to be turned on a couple hours a day, and they're not spinning continually the entire time. And the same way with backup drives. They're designed to come on, back up the data, and then turn back off. The drive we passed around is designed to spin at 15,000 RPMs continually for its entire service life. And so there's a dynamic price difference between the two of them. If I went out and I bought a 1 terabyte hard drive, and I wanted to put it in my desktop, I can get one for $60. If I want a 1 terabyte drive like the one we passed around that's designed for a server, you're probably talking about $1,200. It's that big a price difference because of the robustness of those drives. So one of the cheaper ways, if you don't have all this hardware and you don't have the tape drives and you don't have all this good stuff, is to use an online backup. It's cheap per month, but over time it may be cheaper to look at your own solution. So something like Mozy, Jungle Disk, Backblaze, some of these are fairly affordable. For an average business, you're still going to pay a couple $100 a month in backup. But if I had to spend $10,000 up front for a backup appliance, it may be cheaper. So that's not all of our issues. So one of the big issues we also have is fire. We're putting a lot of electrical devices in a server closet. We're going to have all this stuff overhead. How do I deal with environmental controls? So things like fire, heat, AC. And you think, well, man, why do I need AC for my server? It doesn't need it. If you drive by any of the data centers, so if you drive by Google, the primary thing you see is actually the cooling towers to keep that system cool enough that they can operate. Even back in this room, if I close that door and I spin that server up, it'll heat that room up to about 100 degrees pretty quickly. So we need to deal with it. We need fire issues. What happens if we have a fire? And at least now we're thinking about our employees versus just how do we stop things like fire. So get out of there so we can go to fire. So what do we need to have fire? Well, we need to have that fire triangle. We need fuel, we need oxygen, and we need a heat source. Well, I got a lot of plastic parts, and plastic will burn really good. And I got some heat going on there and electrical. So that fire triangle, when I look in a server closet, is pretty horrible. On top of that then, how do I deal with when things like those UPS, now I have all these batteries with acid in them that are slowly melting in there and bubbling away. Yikes. So a server closet or a server can actually be a pretty dangerous environment. So there's your fire triangle back all the way from grade school when you guys were the fire stompers or whatever they called it. But we have different types of fires, and we need a different type of extinguisher. Because one of the worst things I can do, I have a whole ton of electric in most data closets. I'm going to turn on the sprinkler system and dump it with water. Ooh, maybe I don't want to do that. So that I may need to have special types of fire extinguishers in there. Same as if in my house, I don't want to try to extinguish a cooking fire with water. I probably don't want to, in my business, bring in that. So most bigger closets actually have a system overhead, some way that we can turn out a fire fairly quickly. So water sprinkler systems will work, but what happens to all of our equipment when it gets wet? Not really good for it. We have dry chemical systems, so it dumps powder everywhere. Well, that doesn't really help the computer system either. Those don't tend to really do real well. And then we have, now they're calling them clean agent systems. So clean agent systems supposedly extinguish the fire and don't harm people and things in there. What we used to have, and once you go into some older buildings, I think they've hopefully gotten rid of them, but they used to use something called halon. And they would dump halon gas in there, because halon gas is a really great fire extinguisher. It takes all the oxygen out of the air. What if you're working in there, though? Yeah, it doesn't really harm them because you're dead, but, you know. So now we've got some new systems, some FM2000 and some others. So you want to be careful about what you have in there. So we have to deal with fire. All right, so I'm going to stop here for today. Make sure you have read the chapter. There is one assignment this week. Let me hit this button.